The UC Davis Campus Community Book Project promotes dialogue and builds community by encouraging diverse members of the campus and surrounding communities to read the same book and attend related events. The Book Project, a signature initiative out of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion since 2002, advances the mission to improve both the campus climate and community relations, to foster diversity, and to promote equity and inclusiveness. We're currently in our 19th year. The Book Project in 2020-2021 focuses on the theme of mental health and features graphic memoir Marbles, Mania, Depression, Michelangelo and Me by Ellen Forney. Our theme and selection are supported by a year-long program of lectures, workshops, book discussions, film screenings, exhibits, performances, and more, which this year will take place virtually. Currently, we're wrapping up our program for the year, but a few remaining events we're planning for spring. For more information about the Book Project program, please visit our website where you can find up-to-date information, registration links, and other resources. If you are interested in getting involved with the Book Project, please send us an email, or you can refer to the Book Project website for more information. I'm going to put some links into chat for folks to contact us at the Book Project. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Julie Holland, who will present on good chemistry, the science of connection. Julie Holland, MD, was a fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine and an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the New York University School of Medicine from 1995 to 2012. She's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Temple University School of Medicine and completed her psychiatric residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. She is the editor of 2 nonprofit books which help to fund clinical research: Ecstasy, The Complete Guide, a comprehensive look at the risks and benefits of MDMA, and The Pot Book, a complete guide to cannabis. She is the author of Weekends at Bellevue, 9 Years, On the Night Shift at the Psych ER, and this is a really fantastic title, Moody Bitches, The Truth About the Drugs You're Taking, the Sleep You're Missing, the Sex You're Not Having, and What Really Makes You Crazy. Her most recent book, Good Chemistry, The Science of Connection from Soul to Psychedelics, was published in June 2020. Dr. Holland runs a private practice in Manhattan and is a medical advisor and past medical monitor for several clinical research studies on treating post-traumatic stress disorder, one using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and another examining the effects of various strains of cannabis. Dr. Holland, we are so excited to have you join us this evening, and please take it away.
I am taking it away. Hey, everybody, thank you for coming out on this Thursday evening to listen to what I have to say. So I did recently publish a book called Good Chemistry, and while it is about psychedelics, what it is mostly about really is connection and about how we are sort of hardwired for social interaction and connection, and how when we are isolated, it is a huge stressor for us, and not just sort of psychologically a stressor, but it is actually physiologically a stressor. It is stressful for our bodies to be isolated and segregated. We, as social primates, we are actually categorized as obligatorily gregarious. So we are obligated to be friendly and collaborative. And if you think about how things were back when we were cave people on the savannah, if the group didn't like us, we were not going to survive. No one was going to share their food with you or mate with you or help you build a structure or anything like this. So, and you could easily get picked off by predators or simply not survive because you didn't have any assistance. And so we're really sort of hardwired to make sure that we are socially in a good place. And I will give you an example of this. Right now, I'm sort of scanning all the faces and seeing what people are doing, and they're getting up and they're sitting down, and I'm looking at the faces to make sure, hi, Sandra Shaw, to make sure that that you like me and that you're paying attention to me and that you're not going to try to kick me out of your group, right? And so when you're on a Zoom call, even though you don't realize you're doing it, there is some part of you, and I would say that part is actually the fear center of your brain, really the amygdala, that is driving this sort of what I've come to think of as like a background app that takes a lot of bandwidth and uses up a lot of battery power. And that is that you are scanning for social cues. You're constantly looking at the little faces to make sure that you're not going to get kicked out of the group. And it doesn't matter what group it is. And so if somebody isn't well lit, Karen Broido, I can't really see your face, right? So I don't know. Am I getting a good social cue from you? Am I in the group? Do you like me? So, your brain is constantly looking to fill that missing data. People who don't have their camera on, I can skip right over you. But anyway, if you're wondering why you're exhausted because of back-to-back Zoom meetings all day, this is why. You're scanning for social cues and there's missing data that you're not getting, and your brain can't really let it go. It keeps coming back to look and see how everybody's faces are. So I got really interested in social cues and ostracism because I had something sort of terrible happen to me in middle school, as often happens to kids in middle school, which is that I got kicked out of my friend group. For reasons I won't bother you with. This is 8th grade and nobody really cares anymore. But it really had a profound effect on me. I got kicked out of the in crowd. I had to sort of create a new friend group for myself next year when I was a freshman. And what I saw over when I started to work on a memoir and I looked back at that time, I realized that my displacement from that social group actually triggered a lot of sort of self-soothing behaviors in me. I was biting my nails, I was smoking cigarettes, I gained weight, I started using more drugs, and I started looking at the research showing that when people are socially displaced, when they're ostracized, when they're isolated, this is often how they react. It is a huge social stressor, and so you comfort yourself however you can. What was good for me was that it wasn't just that I was experimenting with drugs, but I was actually taking notes. And it was sort of the earliest experiences of me as a drug researcher was me in high school. And, I joke about it now, and people were certainly concerned about my welfare back then, but it really helped to inform my passions and what was important to me and what I cared about. And it turns out what I cared about in high school in the 1970s, there were a lot of drugs around. I was growing up in the suburbs, and it was not a time of micromanaging and helicopter parents. It was really a time when you had the day to yourself, and when the streetlights came on for nighttime and dinner, that's when you would come home, and nobody really knew where you were after school. You were just, hanging out down the street with your friends or whatever. So I had a pretty long leash growing up. I ended up experimenting a good amount with a lot of pretty intense psychedelics. And it just really informed me about, I ended up learning a lot about the brain and about the brain's chemistry. I got very interested in drugs, and I got interested in psychosis. Because I accidentally ingested something in high school that made me completely psychotic. It was terrifying, but the truth is it got me extremely interested in psychosis and schizophrenia, and I ended up deciding that I wanted to be a doctor and a psychiatrist. I ended up going to University of Pennsylvania because they had a really great major. Actually, they still have it. It's called the biological basis of behavior. So it's kind of like a biopsych, neuropsych sort of a major, and there was a concentration within that major called psychopharmacology, which is a study of the brain and drugs and how drugs affect behavior. So this is why I went to Penn. I mean, I was very into that major. I took almost every class in the major. I ended up going to med school at Temple. But while I was at Penn, it was the summer of 1985. And I was actually living in a castle on campus. There was like a fraternity house that was completely shaped like a castle. And it was that sort of magical summer at Penn that I started reading articles about a new drug. So I'm planning on being a psychiatrist. I'm a pre-med. I'm studying psychopharmacology. And then all of a sudden there's a new drug out. And that's already sort of cause for celebration for me because I'd tried all the other ones. So I was excited about the prospect of something new. But also it turned out that this new drug was being used by therapists and psychiatrists during therapy as a catalyst. And this was the first time that I'd ever really heard about the idea of using a catalyst to make therapy go deeper or be more effective or more efficient. So I got very interested in this idea of, it was a different kind of psychopharmacology. It's not somebody taking a daily dose of an antidepressant. It's somebody having very intensive therapy with a catalyst on board. So I ended up writing a paper about MDMA, and I don't know, maybe 10 years later, that turned into my first book, which is Ecstasy: The Complete Guide. And Megan mentioned that both. I've got two books that I edited that I didn't write. Other people wrote them, and I wrote them, and they're these. And they're both nonprofit books. One is on MDMA and the other is on cannabis. And the proceeds from those books fund clinical research. So one of the things that I did after med school, I went to Mount Sinai for my psychiatric residency, and I did research on schizophrenia at that time. But also I really pushed. I had a meeting with the chairman at Mount Sinai because I wanted to do MDMA research at Mount Sinai. And that was shut down because it was shot down. It was just too early. But 30 years later, the irony is that now Mount Sinai is opening a center for psychedelic studies, traumatic studies, and they're planning on doing MDMA research there. So for the past 30 years, I've been sort of trying to convince people that I think that MDMA assisted psychotherapy has real efficacy and has legs. And that has, eventually borne out to be true. The FDA has granted a breakthrough therapy designation for MDMA, and it will probably be FDA approved within the next 5 years. And so what we're going to be seeing over the next 5 or 10 years, as MDMA becomes FDA approved, and then as psilocybin becomes FDA approved, is we're going to be seeing a completely sort of revolutionary, disruptive way of helping people through trauma that is not going to be the daily dose of antidepressants or daily dose of anti-anxiety medicines, which is what we've got available to us now. So I want to talk a little bit more about this issue of isolation and what it does to us, sort of body and soul, because it's pretty significant. And I wrote about this. I first learned about the effects of isolation when I was researching my book Moody Bitches, which is basically the premise of Moody Bitches is that women are over pathologized, over medicated, that women are naturally cyclical, that hormones do have some effect on how sensitive we are and on our behavior, and that there's a sort of an imbalance of yang and yin energies that a lot of us are taught to sort of repress our yin side. That if we are emotional, that means we're unstable, and you want to be sort of steady and stoic. I mean, I got a lot of messages growing up that, I shouldn't cry, and, I was being a baby if I was too sensitive. And I imagine that some of the men who are listening now got those same messages, that you need to sort of man up and, girls cry, you're a boy. But these messages really come down to sort of pushing down your emotions and suppressing your yin energy in favor of a yang energy, which is much more success-oriented, goal-oriented kind of behavior. Anyway, getting off topic. Isolation. As I said in the beginning, we are sort of hardwired to interpret social isolation as a stressor. Because we are obligatorily gregarious and we are social primates, we are really not used to being socially isolated. And it is a significant stressor for us. And it's not just an emotional stressor, it really affects our physiology. So basically, when you are isolated, it puts the body into a fight or flight state, like a sympathetic state. So most of us have heard of fight or flight or sympathetic nervous system. I feel like, from middle school to medical school, I must have heard of the sympathetic nervous system a dozen times. And it was always sold to me as, fight or flight is the key to our survival. You have to be able to attack or evade and flee, or you're not going to survive. And while that may be true, that there are times when you have to attack or run away or you're not going to survive, the flip side of that is even more true, which is that if you don't fight, if you can just get along with people, if you don't run away, but you actually can stay and collaborate and coordinate and cooperate with people, That's really where survival is at now. On a day-to-day basis, you are going to do better if you have social skills, if you cooperate, if you collaborate. If you're always fighting and running away, in today's society, you're really not going to succeed. Maybe back when we were cave people, that was the key to survival. But now the key to survival actually can be found in the opposite of fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system. So the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system is called the parasympathetic nervous system. And instead of fight or flight, parasympathetic is where we can rest, digest, and repair. So if you think about when you're stressed out and anxious, that means you're in the sympathetic mode, you're in fight or flight. And in that mode, you can't really sleep very well. You don't digest your food very well. You get sort of acid indigestion or ulcers, you have insomnia. But also when you're in fight or flight, your metabolism is in a completely sort of deranged place where it's prioritizing sugar, and you end up with too much sugar in your bloodstream. And also your immune system is also deranged when you're in fight or flight. So when you're in the opposite of fight or flight, you can rest, digest, and very importantly, your body can repair itself, right? So, I mean, if you're like, being chased by a tiger or something, your body is not going to run any of its sort of repair mechanisms, the protocols to repair itself. Those mechanisms aren't going to be enabled when you're in fight or flight. You can't sleep when you're in fight or flight. You can't digest your food. And also you can't have sex when you're in fight or flight. So a lot of the things that we do to sort of keep our machinery working, all of those sort of maintenance things do not go well when we're in fight or flight. So you've got high blood pressure, high blood sugar, so it's a setup for diabetes. Your immune system is deranged, your metabolism is deranged, and all of these things in the sympathetic nervous system, they actually put you in what's called a pro-inflammatory state. So, and inflammation is what we don't want, right? Inflammation is the basis for many diseases, and things like arthritis and diabetes and cancer and heart disease, they all have their basis in inflammation. So what you want to do to stay healthy and have the body repair itself is you want to stay out of fight or flight, you want to be in the parasympathetic mode, and you want to do things that are anti-inflammatory. And some examples of things that are anti-inflammatory, certainly you've heard of an anti-inflammatory diet. And this is the idea where you eat certain foods that don't add to inflammation, don't add to things like high cholesterol or high blood sugar. And really what it comes down to with an anti-inflammatory diet, and I talked about this quite a bit in Moody Bitches, is that you want to eat sort of nutrient-dense whole foods that aren't white, basically. White sugar, white flour, white rice. I mean, these are things that are pro-inflammatory. They're not good for you. So, but also being in fight or flight is pro-inflammatory, which means that being isolated is pro-inflammatory. So the juice that makes the fight or flight system run is adrenaline and cortisol. And over time, bathing your body in cortisol and adrenaline is terrible for you. You get a lot of belly fat. You can have hair loss. And again, this is a pro-inflammatory state where you've got high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high cholesterol. None of these things are things that you want. The juice that runs the parasympathetic, the rest, digest, and repair side, is primarily oxytocin. So this is pretty crucial, right? I imagine most of you have heard of oxytocin. If you want to learn more about oxytocin, Good Chemistry is full of interesting facts about oxytocin. But so if you think of adrenaline, cortisol is the juice that runs fight or flight. Oxytocin is what runs the parasympathetic system. So, and oxytocin is an anti-inflammatory. It has an anti-inflammatory effect on the body. Now, what does oxytocin do? It helps us to be social. What does being social do? It helps to keep us in the parasympathetic anti-inflammatory set. So oxytocin is anti-inflammatory, and any kind of social interaction, even if it's kind of problematic, right? I mean, it's not always easy to be with our friends or with our families. It's problematic. It's still better than being alone. In terms of cortisol and adrenaline, you've got very high levels when you're isolated, and you don't have much oxytocin on board. And one of the things that happens when we're isolated is we actually become more paranoid and fearful of others, because when you're in this fight or flight state, you're not very good at making friends. You know, your social skills are really bad when you're in fight or flight. And if you think about, if you're like, let's say there's a fire in your kitchen and you're very focused on putting out this fire, and you know, you've got adrenaline and cortisol and you just got to get the fire out. You're not very polite with people. You don't stop to chat with anybody. You don't ask your neighbor for a cup of sugar. You just have a fire to put out, and you're sort of in this yang energy. So being in fight or flight is not conducive to being social. And one of the ways that I think about rest, digest, and repair that happens in the parasympathetic system is that part of what gets repaired when you are calm is your social connections get repaired. If you have had a fight, it is only when you're calm and sort of with this yin energy and you're open and you're open-hearted that you can repair your relationships. So when you're in the parasympathetic mode, when you're able to rest, digest, repair, and have sex, this is when you are able to be social. And when you're in fight or flight, your social skills are terrible. And you're even a little bit paranoid in fight or flight. It's just sort of the way the chemistry is. When you're in kill or be kill mode, you're not as trusting. You're not as open to people. What makes you open and trusting? Oxytocin. You're only going to get that in parasympathetic. So one of the things I talk about in Good Chemistry is ways to increase oxytocin. And unfortunately, this book was written before COVID, came out in the middle of COVID in June. And a lot of the recommendations for how people can stay healthy and happy and be in parasympathetic involve things that we really couldn't do last summer, you know, face to face, skin to skin, hugging. You know, a lot of the messages in Good Chemistry were things like put down your book, close your laptop, go outside, be with other people, hug, have eye contact, breathe in pheromones. So some of those things we can't do yet. Some of those things we can do in our own homes, but we can't do out in the world. But I've got a lot of patients who are completely isolated, who've really been alone for months and months. And, you know, I talked to a patient a couple of days ago who said that she's like, no one has hugged her for 8 months. That is a really terrible place to be in. She is extremely anxious and depressed. And one of the things I'm working with my patients now are the ones that have sort of, it's like they've been in a cave for a year and now they don't want to leave. They're not comfortable leaving their house. And I'm seeing this a lot, that people are anxious to go outside. They're worried about maybe the new variants, or you're still, you know, maybe hitting a second wave where you are. But I think that this is, you know, this is going to be an issue that's coming up more and more. A lot of people are really struggling with anxiety this past year. And again, the thing I alluded to before, that when you are displaced socially, you will often soothe yourselves orally. So, you know, at the beginning of the sort of when people started quarantining themselves a year ago, you know, there was this joke that you were either going to become a chunk or a drunk or a hunk. That a lot of people were either going to, you know, the quarantini was going to take on a life of its own, or you're going to be soothing yourself with food and you're going to gain weight. And some of my patients have gained anywhere between 20 and 50 pounds over the last year. And then I've got some people who fell off the wagon, who weren't drinking, who are drinking again. A lot of people fell off the wagon with their diets, you know, the anti-inflammatory diet or a high protein, low carb diet, just can't sustain it with the anxiety. You know, most of us were really brought up to soothe ourselves orally. If you're a little kid and you're crying, they stick a pacifier in your mouth. Maybe if you're lucky, you get a breast in your mouth. Eventually you learn to just suck your own thumb. Yeah, I was definitely a thumb sucker, and then I was a nail biter, and then I started smoking cigarettes, and then I started overeating. And it's really, really easy for me to see the trajectory of how I soothe myself orally, and many of us do. And I think especially during the pandemic, we're seeing this quite a bit. So part of what you're soothing is that you're isolated and you don't really know who your people are or whether you're going to be taken care of in the group. So I appreciate that this isn't always at the top of mind for people, but it really is something that's sort of unconscious and is always running, as I said, in this sort of background app, that there's some part of your brain that is always taking stock of whether you are locked into a group or not. And oxytocin really helps us to open up and to trust other people and to bond with other people. And the other issue is that um, if being social weren't pleasurable, if kissing and hugging and having sex weren't pleasurable, we wouldn't procreate, right? So these things are sort of hardwired to be very pleasurable for us. And it's not that oxytocin gives us pleasure. It's that oxytocin enables the social behavior that gives us pleasure. And actually, the probable way that we're really feeling this pleasure is actually through the endocannabinoid system, which is not the endorphin system. It's not our internal opiate system. It's actually our internal cannabis system. So the endocannabinoid system is something that I explain quite a bit in Moody Bitches and explain even more in Good Chemistry. But basically, even if you've never smoked a joint in your life, you still have cannabis-like molecules coursing through your bloodstream. And you've got receptors from head to toe for these cannabis-like molecules all through your body. And the endocannabinoid system, which is this internal cannabis system, is really what's responsible for making social interaction pleasurable. And if you give an animal cannabis blockers, where it will block these receptors in the endocannabinoid system, those animals, when they're blocked, they're not social and they don't get any pleasure from being social. So the other interesting thing that oxytocin does, besides bonding individual people, and also oxytocin is involved in nursing, pregnancy and delivery, very high levels of oxytocin during delivery and during nursing, also really high levels of oxytocin during orgasm. And really, if you think about why should there be high levels of oxytocin during orgasm, the idea is that to allow you to sort of open and trust and bond with the person that gave you this pleasure, because they are a potential life partner or good parent for your offspring. So one of the things I worry about, because it's so natural to have a burst of oxytocin with orgasm, and because oxytocin enables bonding, and the way this is supposed to work is that when you're having sex with another person, you get this oxytocin release and you bond with this person. But many of us are actually having sex with our laptops these days. There's a lot of people who masturbate with their laptops. And so my question is, when you get that surge of oxytocin from orgasm, are you bonding with your laptop? Are you bonding with your phone? Are you solidifying a bond with whatever brought you to that place? And if there's nobody else there, this is something that I write about and muse about a little bit in Good Chemistry, because it's I'm very interested in this sort of one of the things that oxytocin does actually is it helps to enable neuroplasticity, which is the way that the brain learns and remodels itself, right? So there are new connections being made within synapses, which is the sort of basis for neuroplasticity, is that there are new brain cells being made and new connections being made between brain cells. So this is neurogenesis and synaptogenesis, meaning new synapses are being made. Oxytocin is what enables neuroplasticity. It's what enables learning. And a really interesting example of oxytocin sort of doing a lot of rewiring is that when a woman is pregnant, her brain really gets sort of rewired and reworked, and there's a lot of new brain cells being created during that time, and that is enabled by oxytocin. So I mean, those are some things that happen within a person when oxytocin is released, or between people in terms of bonding. But I also want to talk about what I sort of think of as like the dirty underside, the seamy underbelly of oxytocin, which is what happens in group situations. In group situations, oxytocin enables this kind of thinking, which is, are you on my team or are you on the other team? Are you in my tribe or are you in the other tribe? And so if you think about large group gatherings, like say you go to a concert, and everybody there likes the same performer. They're all at the concert because they like the performer. So everybody has that in common. Maybe they all like the same song and they're all singing along, and there's a real feeling of like unity and bonding within that concert, right? Everybody likes the same music, they're singing the same songs, they're dancing together, and there's a sort of sense of like group mind and social cohesion that happens in these group events. So when I started thinking about that, it made me sort of understand better maybe the experience at like a Grateful Dead show or a Phish concert or something like that, which is, it's almost like this sort of big human carnival. But I also sort of understood better political rallies and this sort of group mind that can come when everybody is at a political rally and they all have the same opinions and they all think the same way and they are sort of solidifying this group cohesion around their beliefs. One of the things I talk about in Good Chemistry is that when you challenge somebody about their beliefs, they will interpret it as if you have attacked their physical body. But the things that people believe in, they hold so close to their own personal identity that when you attack their beliefs, their brain and their amygdala, their fear response, acts as if you are actually attacking their body. So it's something to keep in mind when you are having very heated conversations with people. Once they get into fight or flight and they feel like they're being attacked and they're attacking you, again, no oxytocin, no social skills, more paranoia. Things tend to devolve, basically. So you really need to figure out another way in that isn't quite so just directly attacking what somebody believes in. So I do want to talk a little bit about trauma and healing trauma. And I spend many, many pages in Good Chemistry talking about some new ways to treat trauma, primarily with psychedelics, with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So these are drugs everybody has heard of, things like magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms. Psilocybe cubensis is the name that's given to these fungal spores. They're mushrooms. Obviously people have heard of LSD. I imagine some people here have heard of ecstasy or Molly. So yes, these are illegal drugs. Yes, they are drugs of abuse. But more importantly, from my perspective, is these are compounds which have the potential to allow the process of psychotherapy to just go deeper, more effectively, and more efficiently. The way especially with MDMA therapy, the way I sort of think about it is like, it's like giving anesthesia for surgery. Good therapy takes years to really accomplish. And people, when you start getting too close to the things that are very tender or sensitive, people close down. They don't want to talk about it. They joke. Maybe they miss their next couple appointments or they quit therapy altogether. It's a lot of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back when it comes to therapy. And it can take years and years to really get down to the sort of deeper levels of where the trauma happened. And, if you sort of think about it as like a surgeon trying to get down to this malignant thing and excise it and get it out of the body and examine it, it's a lot easier to do that surgery and get down to that malignant piece if the patient is anesthetized. So it's the same thing with psychotherapy. If you can give MDMA, it's not that the person's asleep, they're very much awake because MDMA is a stimulant. It's a sort of a chemical cousin to methamphetamine. So there's a pretty strong psychostimulant component. But MDMA also is a massive oxytocin releaser. So you are in a very opened, receptive place. And also oxytocin quells the amygdala. It quells that fear center. So not only is a person sort of more open and bonding and trusting with their therapist, but they're not so afraid to dig down and get to those things that are really scary. And because of the oxytocin levels being so high with MDMA, you also have the potential for tremendous neuroplasticity. And this is also true with psilocybin, with LSD, with ayahuasca, with DMT. There's a lot of psychedelics that really enable neuroplasticity. And when you're enabling neuroplasticity, what you're really doing is enabling behavior change. So these compounds, in the context of ongoing therapy, right? You do a lot of preparatory sessions, then you do the drug-assisted therapy, then you do lots of sessions afterwards to integrate whatever you learned during the drug therapy. So this is not just a, sort of a magic bullet, one pill and you're cured. It's in the context of ongoing therapy, both before and after the drug-assisted therapy. But what we're seeing in people who are going through research protocols with MDMA-assisted therapy is that they don't meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder when they reach the end of the study. A very high percentage of people who undergo MDMA-assisted psychotherapy lose their symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They don't need to take daily medications anymore. So I would say, over the past year, I think a lot of us have really been traumatized. I think that the isolation is very traumatizing. And I think what you're going to see over the next 3 to 5 years is more people availing themselves of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, as a way to treat their trauma. We are just starting to put together a research protocol for first responders in New York City, people who have been traumatized by COVID at the workplace. And we're going to be offering MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for those first responders. So I'm very interested in this study moving forward. I'm just looking at the clock, and I really want to include as much Q&A as possible. If people don't have questions, I'll keep yammering, but I really would love to entertain any questions people have about psychiatric medicines, psychedelic medicines, fight or flight, oxytocin, cannabis, MDMA, anything I can answer, I'm happy to do so.
Thanks so much, Dr. Holland. So we do have a couple of questions that have come in, and I invite our participants, share your thoughts, comments, questions in the chat. We'll be sure to get to them as much as we can. So the first question that we received has to do with what you were talking, Dr. Holland, about the isolation of the pandemic and kind of our virtual reality that we've been living in for now a year. And the fact that, obviously it has had some negative effects, but I think there have been some upsides to it. So the question is, I had a lot of projects to work on and enjoyed the downtime during the pandemic, getting a lot of things done that I hadn't had time to work on before. Is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with someone who's enjoying this time in isolation?
No, that's a really good question, because a lot of my patients have been pretty happy, but they're like embarrassed to say they're doing okay. And I think a lot of us are sort of embarrassed to say that we're doing okay. There's something called survivor guilt that's very, very common with trauma. When people all around you are being traumatized, but you're not, you end up feeling bad about it. Lots of people are making the best of the situation. And the truth is, some people are introverts, and they don't necessarily like the day-to-day demands on them socially. And, many of us have really found a silver lining by turning inward and spending more time at home, maybe more time with our families. Some of my patients that are doing especially well are people with little kids, where they felt very torn. They had to work, but they really wanted to help raise their kids. And now they're not working. They're just at home focusing on their kids. So there are plenty of people who are doing okay during this year, and that's great. But also, I will say that suicides are up, and suicide attempts are up, and alcohol overdoses are up, and polydrug overdoses continue to be up. And the amount of kids being admitted to psych wards is up, and the amount of beds available for kids is down. So there is something going on where there are definitely swaths of demographics that really aren't doing well right now with the isolation.
Great, thank you. So follow-up question about being creative on how we think about what counts as socialization in this day and age. Would you say that online interactions, such as emailing someone, counts as socialization?
So I was in touch with an oxytocin expert who's talking about the fact that we still get some oxytocin even though it's through a screen. His estimate is 70%. I don't think it's that high, and I don't really know how he arrived at that number. It seemed like sort of a pulled out of a hat kind of a number, but it is safe to say that we get some sense that we are not alone when we are talking to somebody on the phone, or emailing, or texting, or Zooming. So it's definitely better than nothing, but I think that physiologically we would get more from skin to skin contact and eye contact and hugging and being held than we will get from electronic communication. And, coincidentally, when babies are held, it's not just the endocannabinoid system, but the endorphin system really is kicked in too. And, before the pandemic, we had two epidemics that people were worried about. And one was the opioid overdose epidemic, and the other was the loneliness epidemic. And the truth is that the more isolated and lonely people were getting, the more we were having people drinking themselves to death, overdosing on opiates. I don't think it's a coincidence, although obviously the issue of how available the opiates were, not just Purdue, but the distributors. I mean, there were a lot of bad actors in creating a tremendous glut of opiates. But the reason why opiates feel so good to people and people end up getting addicted to opiates is that they really mimic what your body would do naturally if you were being held and stroked and soothed. And so it does sort of end up being a little bit of a substitute for being held and feeling safe and cared for and loved and attended, because those sort of feelings, it's not just the endocannabinoid system, but it's also the endorphin system that gives you the pleasure when you're being attended to and loved and cared for. And there's also this, there's something called havening, where you sort of stroke yourself, and you're supposed to, while you're stroking from shoulder to elbow, you're supposed to say things like, I am loved, I am cared for, I am looked after. And if you actually bother to do this to yourself, it does kind of make you feel a little bit better. And it is sort of triggering your own sort of endorphin system. But it's not a coincidence in my mind that the numbers of people using opiates went up and up, paralleling how isolated and lonely people felt before the pandemic.
Thank you. So we have a question that kind of recalls your hunk response to COVID-19. I really like that, chunk, drunk, or hunk. The question is, many of us have increased our exercise routines in the pandemic. Exercise seems to release feelings of pleasure and perhaps is an activity that generates endorphins. Is exercise a repair function?
It is, but I'll tell you something. It turns out that the high from running or from exercise isn't as much endorphins as we thought. It looks like it's actually more endocannabinoids. And some really recent research just came out where they would give exercising people opiate blockers, naltrexone, blocking the opiate receptor, and the exercising people would still get that runner's high. It looks like it probably is more from the endocannabinoid system. But yes, exercise will put you over in, I'm not going to say it puts you in repair. It's a little tricky, right? Because if you're sprinting, you are kind of in fight or flight while you're exercising. And, one of the things I will do for my patients who are, some people feel like they have adrenal burnout, where they're just like so stressed and running on empty. Those people really shouldn't be doing cardio. They should be doing yoga for exercise, right? Where you put yourself in parasympathetic. Yoga, I mean, anytime you're breathing deeply through your nose, you're more likely going to be in parasympathetic. And when you're panting, you're going to be in sympathetic. So their exercise is anti-inflammatory. Yoga is anti-inflammatory. Meditation is anti-inflammatory. Just relaxing is anti-inflammatory. So, but that's not the same thing as repairing, right? I mean, if you're exercising, your body's not going to repair itself. But as soon as you're done exercising, your body will start to repair itself. That's what happens in the rest phase. But anyway, I nudge my patients like crazy about cardio. Cardio absolutely has antidepressant effects, clear antidepressant effects. Cardio also increases neuroplasticity. So it can do what oxytocin can do. And actually antidepressants also can increase neuroplasticity. So there are a lot of ways to skin the cat.
Thank you. Next question. Do you believe MDMA will be used more often than other quote unquote natural psychotropics such as mushrooms or ayahuasca? I can't say that word. You're going to say it for me. Right. Ayahuasca for addiction and or serious anxiety.
So I really think that MDMA and psilocybin and ayahuasca, or at least the components of ayahuasca, which is DMT, I think those things are going to become mainstays in the field of psychiatry, but it's not going to happen overnight. But, here's the way I think of it is in terms of taking a daily dose of something to feel better, it's a little bit like sweeping the dust under the carpet. You keep sweeping the dust under the carpet and pretty soon you have a very lumpy carpet. And a lot of times taking antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds, you're just treating the symptoms. You're not getting to the cause of the symptoms. And so the way I sort of think about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is It takes that carpet, brings it out back, bangs the hell out of it, vacuum the floor, put the carpet down, no more lumps. Now let's start over and see how you feel. So, it's getting to the core issues. Why are you anxious? And, a lot of it really comes down to childhood trauma and things that happened in early childhood or in adolescence um, that left like deep wounds. And soothing, it's the soothing that needs to be done, it starts then, it never really goes away. It's hard to soothe yourself in a healthful way. It's tricky, like if you're anxious and you're soothing yourself with food, you're probably not eating a salad. you know and people drinking or smoking cigarettes or using any drugs, um there's this sort of numbing that happens, that you don't want to feel the pain, so you push it down. And you spend a lot of psychic energy trying not to feel bad. And when you have this very intense therapy, when you really actually bring up all this muck that you've been pushing down and start to sift through it and figure out why it's there and where it goes, you're having real healing from the inside out. I mean, it's almost like, it's a really gross analogy, but it's very much on my mind. If you have like an abscess or something, you have to actually really dig down and get that pus out, and it's down there deep, and you're not going to heal. You put a Band-Aid on it and a little bit of topical antibiotic, you're not getting down to where the real problem is. So it's looking at the root cause for the symptoms instead of just sort of papering them over and yeah, just papering over the symptoms. So I really do think that we are going to be seeing MDMA assisted psychotherapy, psilocybin assisted psychotherapy, especially for depression. And this person asked about using it for treating addiction, and absolutely that is what's going on. Yes, there's a study right now using MDMA assisted psychotherapy to treat alcohol addiction, where they're having really strong results. Cocaine addiction, there was a study done with psilocybin to treat cocaine addiction that was done down in I want to say Alabama. And cigarette smoking, which is pretty much the hardest thing to quit. It's harder even to stop smoking cigarettes than it is to stop using heroin. And there was a study that came out of Johns Hopkins where they used psilocybin assisted psychotherapy to get people to quit cigarettes. And these were people who had been smoking for 20 years, had tried to quit multiple times, couldn't quit. And they got over 80% of those people quit with psilocybin. So I think that you are going to be seeing these sort of treatments. Even though it seems counterintuitive to give a drug to treat somebody who's addicted to drugs, what you're really talking about is not like a good time drug. It is like a very intense therapy session that is enabled by the drug. And that's what's really doing the work.
We've had a couple of questions about the use of drugs such as MDMA to treat other disorders. In particular, what about schizoaffective disorder? Would one of these treatments supervised professionally be an option with positive results? And the person who posed the question also would want to know about the risk.
Yeah, so right now, there is no work being done at all in people with schizophrenia or people with schizoaffective disorder. These are like a very vulnerable patient population. And it's really easy to destabilize somebody who has bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia. So right now, all of these research protocols don't let anyone through the protocol if they have a history of psychosis or even a family history of psychosis. So it may be down the line that we will discover that we can use these medicines for those disorders. But right now, no one with a psychotic disorder or a history of psychosis is being allowed to enter any of these protocols.
How about this as a treatment for ADHD?
So ADHD is not typically related to trauma. It really is brain chemistry. And it doesn't go away, right? You have to take something pretty much every day or every time that you want to focus. So these medicines are not for daily use. So I don't think that you're going to be able to see you're definitely not going to like have a MDMA assisted therapy or psychedelic assisted psychotherapy help with ADHD. Where you may get real benefit though is from microdosing, which we haven't really talked about. So microdosing is when you take a much smaller dose, about a tenth of a typical dose, and you would take that every few days, either 5 days on, 2 days off, or like every 3 or 4 days. Now, there are people who are saying that microdosing psilocybin or microdosing LSD can be used to treat ADHD because it can help people to focus. I also, my patients, I mean, I prescribe a lot of stimulants because they really work, things like Adderall, the Vyvanse, those things really do work for ADD, but they're not very comfortable. And I definitely have some patients who are microdosing. I also have a lot of patients who use CBD for ADD. So CBD, as you probably all know, is cannabidiol. It is sort of the anti-anxiety component of cannabis-based medicines. But it not only does it keep people sort of calmer, it gives them sort of a calm focus. So I have some patients who are only using CBD for focus, and then I have some people who are combining ADD meds with CBD for focus.
Thank you. So we have a follow-up to that question along the lines of what you've been saying about treatment for ADHD. I'm wondering what your perspective is on using psychotropic drugs for the treatment of trauma in someone who also has ADHD, given the fact that a stimulant would have a different effect on them in comparison to someone who doesn't have ADHD.
Right. I mean, that's a good point, right? That people who have ADD often they don't necessarily get sedated from stimulants, but they don't get activated in the same way. But the real, the sort of magic of MDMA in the psychotherapy session isn't just from its stimulant effect. It is a massive serotonin releaser and a massive oxytocin releaser. So that increased serotonin and increased oxytocin, you don't get with ADD meds. You don't get with methamphetamine. You only get with MDMA. So I think it's fair to say that people with ADD would still have a similar effect from MDMA as other people.
Thank you. The next question is a kind of a long one. I'm going to go ahead and read it from my notes. We surely hear a lot about positive effects of oxytocin these days and how it is almost a panacea. However, the work by our own UC Davis behavioral psychologist, Brian Trainer, showed that actually after negative social interactions, oxytocin promotes avoidance of unfamiliar social situations. When stressed, mice can show a form of social anxiety, staying away from unfamiliar mice instead of approaching. The new study shows that a single dose of a drug that blocks the activity of oxytocin restored normal social behavior in stressed female mice. Obviously, this is still in research and there are many gender effects present as well. The question is, what does this mean for us if it really turns out that oxytocin makes good experience better, but bad experiences even worse?
That is really interesting and very likely true. And I think it means for us exactly that. I mean, in the chapter on good chemistry, when I talk about the social effects of oxytocin, that is when I really go over all the sort of potential negative sides. But beyond that, I don't really have too much to say. I mean, this really early research that definitely was not, I did not come across it when I was doing research for this book. So that would have been like 2 years ago when I was researching this book. I mean, it was done about a year ago, and then it got published last June. So I'm not familiar with those studies, but it's definitely interesting and something I would like to learn more about, and I probably will tomorrow.
Thank you. Another question about oxytocin. Do oxytocin levels decrease with age? It seems we get more mellow, more passive as we age.
Well, one thing is that oxytocin does seem to work more in an estrogen-rich environment. So as women age, their estrogen levels lower. And actually, to some degree, as men age, and especially if they have more body fat, their estrogen levels can kind of go up a little bit in relation to their testosterone. So it may be why, older women are sort of a little bit more cranky with a shorter fuse and perhaps less accommodating than they are when they're in their 20s or 30s, and why older men, can be a little bit more sensitive and cry more easily as they get older. But I think it is safe to say that oxytocin levels probably do wane when you get to be 70, 80 years old. And again, men have less oxytocin and more of something called vasopressin, and then women have less vasopressin and more oxytocin. And one of the things vasopressin does, if you think of oxytocin as sort of tend and befriend, right? You're tending to your social connections, and you're tending to the people who are in your group, whether they're your family or your tribe. Vasopressin is more about like protect and defend. And it tends to be more about protecting the progeny, as opposed to protecting social relationships.
Thanks so much. So we have one more audience question, and then I hope that you will indulge a question from me as well. So our last audience question is, if you could please talk more about isolation versus solitude, in light of the fact that solitude can be viewed as something positive.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. There is a lot to be said for silence and solitude. And actually, when we were talking about all the things that can engender neuroplasticity, and we said that exercise can create neuroplasticity and oxytocin enables neuroplasticity, so does silence. Silence enables neuroplasticity. So sometimes just being alone to sort of shut out the outside world will put you in the parasympathetic state where you will have higher oxytocin levels and more neuroplasticity. So I guess, the idea with solitude is that you're hopefully you're choosing it. The thing that's happening now with isolation is that people are isolated who don't want to be isolated. I mean, I think of solitude as sort of this like solace or peaceful place that you go because you want to be alone. When you don't want to be alone is when it's a stressful situation. Or, like for instance, I have patients who, haven't seen their parents because they don't want to get them sick and they haven't gotten vaccinated yet, things like this. They want to be with their family and they can't be, or they want to go back to work and they can't. So I think that is really different from solitude, which I feel like solitude sounds lovely and it's something you're choosing. One thing I'll say, solitary isolation, right? Prison. One of the things that happens in isolation, besides being in fight or flight, or because of being in fight or flight, where you don't have neuroplasticity, it's very hard to learn in isolation. If you put an animal in sort of let's say you take an animal out of social housing and you put it in a place and then it gets shocked, and then you put it back in social housing again. If you put it in the shocking place, it remembers the shocking place and it gets nervous. If you take an animal from social and you shock it and then you put it in isolation, when you put it back in the shocking room, it doesn't remember that it was shocked there. I mean, there's something about consolidating new information that happens best in social situations and doesn't happen very well in isolation. So the bottom line is we don't learn well in isolation and we don't have much neuroplasticity when we're in isolation.
Thanks so much. Final question. So I've been I'm trying to find my footing in all these really fantastic, varied perspectives that you're bringing to your work and your research. And your orientation as a researcher and clinician obviously includes a lot of forward-thinking, perhaps less mainstream perspectives. Are there any other perspectives that inform your work that may be missing or perhaps misrepresented in what we consider modern medicine?
Well, the other aspect of my practice is harm reduction. I work from a harm reduction perspective, which means that I sort of take the patient where they are. I don't, there's some psychiatrists who won't treat somebody unless they're abstinent. Whereas somebody in harm reduction will sort of take the patient wherever they are and say, I'm willing to work with you because any change at all toward healthy behavior will be rewarded and encouraged. And I won't have sort of a zero tolerance policy or abstinence or nothing, or there were clinics I would work at where if a patient had a positive drug screen, they would get kicked out of the clinic. which is a little bit ridiculous. I mean, the reason they're coming to the clinic is that they need help and they need support so that they'll stop using substances, or at least, use things more safely. So to kick them out, it just never really made any sense to me. So I think that the harm reduction, I've been practicing harm reduction since the mid 80s, and I think it's only gotten sort of more popular and more understood. But it sounds like one of the things this person is sort of asking is are my views outside the typical views of psychiatrists, and how do I deal with that? And I will say that yes, not every psychiatrist thinks the way I do. Not everyone is as sort of bullish on the psychedelic industry really disrupting psychiatry. I'm okay with that. I've gotten used to, 30 years ago, I was trying to convince my chairman to do MDMA PTSD research, and, he had never heard of it and thought it was crazy. And, now he's the CEO of Mount Sinai, and they're going to have a center there, like it or not. So things eventually, people eventually come around to my way of thinking, is sort of my experience. It might take 30 years, but I will prove to be right eventually. So, I'm not very ostracized from mainstream psychiatry. I think that there are plenty of psychiatrists who do sort of understand that this is coming down the pike, whether they're ready for it or not.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Holland, for joining us. Dr. Holland's
very
on the
welcome.
East Coast, so you are 3 hours ahead of us, and we really appreciate you coming into our virtual space 3 hours ahead. So thank you again. I want to remind everyone that today's event was recorded. We will put the recording up on the Campus Community Book Project website, and also on our website, you can find a calendar of our upcoming events. So I want to share some information as folks are leaving about our next program. So on behalf of the Campus Community Book Project, I hope that you'll be able to join our next program on Tuesday, April 13th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. We will welcome our featured author, Ellen Forney, back to UC Davis virtually to participate in a panel discussion on mental health, self-care, advocacy, and activism, and also on her latest book, Rock Steady, Brilliant Advice for My Bipolar Life. You can register on the Book Project website, and all are welcome at this free event. Again, thank you to our speaker, to everyone who joined us this evening, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to see you at a future Book Project program. Good night, everyone.
Thanks very much for having me, you guys. Have a good night.